REND Chapter 0, Prologue. 1:42 p.m, Tuesday the 13th of March, 2125. The woman sat across from him in an old-fashioned grey suit, the kind of white shirt and sharkskin-coloured jacket that important people wore in old movies. She wasn't ugly, but her professional demeanour and short-cropped silver hair weren't to his tastes, and he kept getting distracted by the way her eyes changed colour in the light of her touchpad. The desk between them was a screen, a switched-off monitor on which the woman's high-cut features were reflected, and he looked away from it to peer through a slanted window. "Is it too bright?" the woman asked, monotone. Outside, the megalopolis was bathed in daylight, a claustrophobic wall of superstructures and great towers that, like black and silver mirrors, showed sun and clouds he would not have otherwise seen. That sun also shone through the office window, casting the interior in a light that soon became glaring, and he had been forced to shield his eyes with his hand. "A little," he replied. She gave a nod, eyes still on her touchpad. Then the window darkened just enough to paint the room in shadow. There was silence then, and nothing else to focus on, except for a series of commendations framed against the wall. Diplomas in political philosophy, appointments to the United Nations Security Council, and finally promotion to Deputy Recruitment Director for the local branch of the Intelligence Service. Most were holographic images, but that last one was on framed paper, and it especially caught his eye. There wasn't much paper around anymore. "I must say, Mr. King, your resume is impressive," the woman said, lifting her now green eyes towards him. "I see why you were referred to me directly." "Please call me Aiden," he said, shifting attentively in his chair and giving her a polite, if not slightly awkward, smile. "Though I have to admit, I didn't think I would be invited to an interview with someone so important. I'm very thankful for this opportunity. It's been my dream for years." "You're clearly a talented candidate, Aiden. Let me ask, these results, did you work hard for them, or did they come naturally?" "Both, I think. I suppose I was born lucky, but that doesn't mean I didn't have to work. I don't think anyone can succeed without effort." She smiled. "And university? Does the prospect of a higher education and the possibility of a career in academia or science not appeal to you?" "Well, yes, I suppose so. I won't lie. I've had offers from most of the top universities: Oxford, Harvard, Johannesburg, Mombasa, St. Petersburg, Peking, Tokyo. Others too, but none as prestigious. But I don't know." Aiden paused, giving a small shrug. "It doesn't feel right, if that makes sense." The woman tilted her head, crossing her hands atop the touchpad she lay down on the surface of her desk. "In what way?" "I've always wanted to serve my home. My father was a soldier and saw combat in Iran and North Korea, and my older sister is in law enforcement. Maybe the call to enlist runs in my family. And I want to travel. I want opportunities beyond what normal university will provide." She watched him carefully, eyes slowly shifting from green to pale violet. "Well, Aiden, I'll be blunt. The intelligence service would love to have you," she replied. "Your aptitude test score results place you in the 99.98 percentile, which, as you know, opens essentially every role you could think of in our organization. Field agent, intelligence analyst, researcher. We could train you for anything. Based on that, your family history, and your background, I'm able to guarantee you a position right now. If you want it, that is." Aiden sat back in his chair, blinking in surprise. "Really? That's it? It's that simple?" The woman smiled. "It's that simple." "Then I accept," he said. "Do I need to sign anything?" She shook her head. "Not at this moment, no." The recruiter looked down at her touchpad, switching off its screen and removing it from her desk surface to slot away beneath. Before long, Aiden felt the atmosphere of the room change based on nothing more than a sudden and subtle shift in her body language. It was tense, and something told him that despite her experience in her field, she was struggling with how to broach a subject that made her uneasy. She was looking down the faintest amount, trying to figure the exact sequence of words she would have to use to accomplish a task someone else had given her. She was cool about it, clearly trained to prevent her body language from betraying her, but Aiden could still see it. That had always been one of his gifts, Aiden, she began to say, I'm afraid to say that I have not been entirely honest with you as to the purpose of this interview. Aiden watched her closely. Really? How so? You are an impressive candidate, we both know that. But if we had no further interest in you, you would not be sitting here with me. Another recruiter would have been more than adequate to handle this process. I was asked to meet with you today because your unique attributes have presented us, and you, an extremely rare opportunity. You said you wished to travel. Have you ever wanted to go to Kanto? Kanto in Japan, he asked. Sure, I suppose. She nodded. The United Nations Intelligence Service and the United Nations Security Council it falls under are in the process of creating a new intelligence and anti-terrorism organization based there. It's getting funding from both public and private sectors, and several of the most powerful countries and megacorps on the planet are cooperating to make it a reality. Aiden looked confused for a moment, glancing down from the woman's eyes to the plain grey buttons of her jacket. Megacorps? I thought it was illegal to have corporate interests in UN affairs. They used to call it lobbying, didn't they? The woman gave a nod. It's not entirely the same thing, she said. But you are correct. This new organization will exist beyond both United Nations and corporate jurisdictions, and it will stay secret for the first few years of its operation. You must understand that this organization represents the possibility of peaceful collaboration between rival megacorps who have, unofficially, warred against each other for decades. It could serve to bring them under a single committee of oversight, a table which UNIS, and by extension the UNSC, has a seat at. Aiden had to stop and think. He had always been politically inclined, and he had never agreed with the idea of corporations being involved with government. For 70 years, many corporations had held more power than the states that regulated them, and it was no great secret that those regulations could not be enforced. Corporations had their own private security forces, military-grade arsenals, fanatically loyal mid-level employees, and competing aspirations that often brought them to violent confrontation. The news feeds were always filled with suspected corporate murders, espionage, and Machiavellian schemes. Yet it was rare that anyone was ever held accountable. Law enforcement agencies and regulatory committees lived at the mercy of their generous donations, and their CEOs were more like bosses from old mafia movies or ancient warlords than they were business owners and entrepreneurs. Was it really a good idea to include them in the creation of an intelligence service? I'm not too sure, Aiden admitted. I don't know if I would want to be part of something like that. Megacorporations working together could be a good thing, sure, but what about the harm they could cause? And even if the UN is at the table, would they really have any power over a supposedly independent organization? With all due respect, it sounds like a risky, nearly reckless gamble. The woman watched him. You're right, of course. It is risky. But there's always risk in this field, Aiden, and in this case that risk is vastly outweighed by the potential rewards. And you wouldn't be alone in taking it. The Security Council are donating hundreds of employees to this endeavour, from scientists to analysts, from operatives to security guards. You would not be in danger, and you would not be alone. Aiden looked at the way she crossed her fingers, frowning. You still haven't explained what it is you want me to do there, or why you want to send me at all. Because of your test results, because you came to us, because you want to work in this field. The organisation we're discussing is looking for a select few, for those with nearly perfect scores to spearhead its future as elite operatives in the field. You're inexperienced and untrained, but that can be fixed. We want to shortlist you, Aiden, and put you forward as one of them. Aiden could hardly believe what she was saying. He also couldn't help but smile. What the woman was telling him sounded almost too strange to be true, like something contrived specifically to massage his ego and tease a childhood dream. What young boy did not want to be a spy, to be the heroic secret agent sent to save the world and get the girl? That's not what she was offering him, of course, but in the cold reality of his newfound adulthood, would there ever be an offer closer? Would he ever forgive himself if he told her no? What's it called? This organisation? He asked, his mind made. The woman tapped her finger down on the surface of her desk, and its screen came to life with bright, pale colours. It has only a working name, she said, already opening an application form. But for now, it's called the Research, Engage and Neutralize Division. REND, Aiden said to himself, slowly and quietly. He looked out through the dulled window, imagining himself returning home to those streets as someone respected, mysterious, wealthy, not famous in the traditional sense, but known as a man who had done something good, who had fought terrorists and saved lives, a man who had done something that mattered. "I'll do it," he finally answered. "It's an opportunity I would be stupid to pass up." "Fantastic," the recruiter replied, typing away on the screen of her desk. "There is one more thing, however. What will you tell your family?" "That I'm going to university." 2:48 p.m., Tuesday the 13th of March, 21:25. Aiden looked into the elevator mirror, running his fingers through light brown hair that had been combed into a preppy style that didn't suit him. Behind him, individuals in smart dress stood in silence, giving attention to nothing but their own personal devices. The elevator was close to crowded, and yet every member of it stood alone, and Aiden had to be careful not to nudge those around him as he changed his hair into something less formal. He saw the reflections of artificial eyes, reds, pinks, violets, silvers, all as easily changed as contact lenses. Only his own were natural, the same pale blue as his father's, and yet to see them suddenly made him unsure. Was he really making the right decision? Could he really be what they wanted him to be if he was forced to change them? The elevator came to a halt, and the metal doors opened behind him, the mirror's reflective screen changing into a message of thanks. He turned, following the others out into a wide street of 10,000 people swarming beneath bright sunlight, flanked by a road of swift-moving cars. The occasional flying vehicle broke out in the air above them, swerving around trunks of glass and steel in near silence. "Aiden, where are you?" a feminine voice asked in his ear. "I've just come out of the elevator," he replied. "I'm on level 0. Turn off to where that burger place is. I've parked just outside." "All right." He turned and followed a faceless crowd. He was in a rich part of town, where most wore smart suits or clothing as strangely fashionable as expensive, but down each side street there were a far more interesting variety of people. 1,000 individuals from 100 subcultures walked in those places, shrouded in shadow and yet brighter all the same. He turned down one such street, passing a dozen small restaurants and stores, and entrances to inner-city apartment blocks where people sat at food stalls and ate. One woman screamed at her retro phone while marching past him, and he found his eyes drawn down a nearby alley where men with mechanical limbs spoke around a portable heater. All of a sudden they began fighting, breaking into grapples and shoves and angry yelling, but Aiden only rolled his eyes and moved on. All of a sudden, a woman stepped out in front of him. "I got you a beep," she tried to say, but her voice cut off as Aiden walked into her, knocking what she was holding to the ground. He panicked, rushing to help and to apologize profusely, but then he realized who it was. "Damn it, Sarah," he said. Aiden's sister looked down at what she dropped, sighing. "Good thing they're in foil, I guess," she said, reaching down to pick 2 foil-wrapped burgers from the ground. "But no harm, no foul." With a slight grin, she handed one to him. "Thanks," Aiden replied. As he unwrapped it, Sarah brushed a strand of brown hair back behind her ear. "You need to watch where you're going, Aiden," she told him, turning to lead him towards a grey car parked nearby. "Well, maybe you shouldn't just step in front of people?" Aiden asked, following her. Sarah moved around to the driver's side door and unlocked it with a press of her finger, then climbed inside. When his own door opened, he climbed in after her, taking a bite of his burger to find Sarah already part through her own. "Try not to make a mess in my ewer," Sarah struggled to say, her mouth full. Aiden swallowed his bite and looked across at her. "I'd be more worried about you," he said, causing her to chortle. "Besides, I didn't buy me the burger." After she swallowed, Sarah had a grin on her face. "Actually, you owe me for that." "Pfft, bitch," he joked. "Don't call me a bitch, Dick," she replied, turning to punch him in the arm. "Ow! You know the one who throws the first punch loses the argument, right?" Sarah rolled her eyes. "Is that a quote from one of your philosophers?" Because in my experience, the one who throws the first punch usually wins it. I think it depends how hard the punch is, he replied. Sarah stared at him a moment, then laughed and leaned back into her seat. Car, take us home, she said. The car lit up as she took another bite of her burger, and soon it was pulling itself out onto the road and driving away. So, how did your meeting go? Fine, I guess, Aiden replied between bites of his own. Still not going to tell us what it was about? She asked. Mum is starting to get scared you're in some kind of trouble, you know. He looked across at her a moment as the car took a side road up onto a slipway above the street level, where it began to increase in speed until the view outside was little more than a blur. Well, I guess I can tell you now. I didn't want to say anything in case it turned out to be nothing, but it did. So, I've been offered a big scholarship to go to university. I think I'm going to take it. Sarah looked at him, her eyes wide. I knew it. My genius brother is going to university. You know, I have friends who live down near Oxford. I'm sure they can point out some great places for you to live. Yeah, but I'm not going to Oxford. I'm going to, Tokyo. Sarah almost choked. Tokyo University? You mean in Kanto, in Japan? Yeah, Aiden answered sheepishly. Aiden, are you sure? That's on the other side of the planet. I don't even know how many kilometers away it is, and we can't exactly pop down for dinner, can we? It's about 9,400 km, Aiden replied. And yeah, I know, but I want to travel. And well, it's Kanto. It's the biggest city on Earth. The freaking United Nations are headquartered there. Do you even speak Japanese? Sarah asked him. I speak a little bit, but that doesn't matter. Everyone speaks English now. I mean, if it's what you want to do, I'll support you. I'm sure Mum will too. Thanks, Sarah, he replied. It won't be until September, so you'll still have 6 months of me. The university is going to sort everything out. Huh, imagine that, Sarah said, scrunching up her burger foil and throwing it into a small bin by her leg. My young, innocent 18-year-old brother leaving this tiny, unimportant island off the coast of Europe to go all the way to another tiny, unimportant island off the coast of Asia. He smirked a little. I could always not go, you know. I could stay on this tiny, unimportant island and do other things, like join the police, maybe. Ha, Sarah exclaimed. Please don't. We're trying to solve crime, not exacerbate it. You'll do good, though. Dad would be proud. Thanks, Aiden replied, turning to peer out of the window. Giant buildings flew past them in a blur, 1,000 neon lights leaving 1,000 trails across the glass. He wondered what Japan would be like, and all the ways it would be different from England. Would he even like it there? Maybe he shouldn't take the offer after all. Maybe he actually should go to university. Oxford was a nice place, he'd heard. He finished the rest of his burger in silence, pushing those thoughts out of his head. He was an adult now, a grown man, and he had made a decision. There was nothing left but to follow it. REND. Chapter 1. A Pale Horse. 12:05 a.m., Thursday the 9th of October, 2132. The bowels of Kanto City cried in the night, a forest of engineering and disposed machinery screeching with strain and rust. As it passed crescendo, a man's scream joined in, a terrified, high-pitched wail reaching out into darkness as he struggled to clamber and climb from his pit. When the sounds of advanced industry waned, so too did the man's voice. Soon there was nothing more than the rain, falling through the shadows of great, black, angled towers that reached so high they disappeared into dark clouds. Far above him, bridges, pipes, and metal structures formed incomplete ceilings, lit only by a lambent of coloured words and signs, neon ghosts in distant fade. Rainwater coagulated on any surface it could find, then poured down from corners or cracks, thick, freezing streams splashing onto an ancient and forgotten ground. Aiden King was curled into a fetal position amidst garbage and discarded electronics, hugging his arms and shivering from the wet and the cold. His entire body burned from the inside, like acid was spilling into his bloodstream, and his head was being pulverized by something that he wished would kill him. His eyes were clenched shut, and he could do nothing but lie there and beg that whatever was happening to him would end. Footsteps. the unmistakable sound of boots hitting wet ground, and the patter of rain hitting plastic or rubber coat. Aiden groaned, turning his head just enough to look at the source of the noise. A figure wearing a dark green coat moved across a walkway high above him and paused under a light just long enough to light a cigarette under his hood. Then, without ever noticing Aiden was there, he disappeared through an automated door. "Help me," Aiden tried to say, though through the chattering cold his voice was too weak to be heard. He eventually reached out a pale, wet hand and tried to grab something, anything from the nearby scrap that he might use. There was no thought process behind this, no plan of action, just an overwhelming desire to find something that could ease his suffering. He found nothing of value. A broken screen, a rusting rod of metal, part of a discarded firearm. He eventually dragged his legs and managed to get up to his knees, where a pale, iron-tasting substance fell from his half-open mouth. He spat the rest out, watching thoughtlessly as it washed away in the rain. Soon he was pushing himself to his feet. His eyes burned, and he wiped them with the sleeve of a pale blue shirt that he didn't recognize. Where was he? Why was he wearing clothes that weren't his? He began to walk. He stumbled at first, a dizziness filling his head that made the dark street sway ahead of him, and he had to fight to maintain his balance. After some time he found it fading, becoming clear-headed for the first time since he woke in that accursed place, and dredged forward through an endless storm of rain. Where was he? Kanto. He somehow knew that, though he didn't know how. But where? In some lower, forgotten part of the city, some abandoned area or complex. Where was everyone? Even run-down neighborhoods were occupied by the forgotten. Homeless people, stray animals, or criminals who roamed the streets keeping lookout. Yet apart from the figure on the bridge, all he had seen were pits and piles of trash, scrapyard heaps growing up the sides of walls like mold. There were no windows in the buildings he walked past, just broken screens. Occasionally the inescapable world of advertisement revealed itself in a flickering, stuttering video or product placement. But he limped past them. Eventually he found an automated door, but no amount of knocking, moving or pressing on its control panel could get it to open. It showed no signs of life, a piece of dead circuitry entombed in a wall of concrete and graphene. He left it and moved on. Several minutes later he came across a small, open area. It was as wide as a 2-lane road and not much longer than a train carriage, yet it was filled with the skeletons of abandoned food and market stalls. Any discernible colour had been stripped from their surfaces years ago until only steel and rust remained. But on the far side, Aiden saw a dim yellow light in a perpetual cycle of waxing and waning. He approached, squinting through the rain to get a better view, and saw an automatic door that was stopped from fully closing by a brick. He approached, reaching his arm into the gap between the door, and forced it open wide enough for him to climb through into an interior hallway. Like the market square, the hallway was stripped of colour that could have given it character, yet it was filled with blue garbage sacks strewn across the floor. A dim, flickering light came from the ceiling above, and stained stairs at the side climbed up to further floors. It was quiet and cold, yet even there he was still significantly more comfortable than he had been in the rain. He felt compelled to go up, so he climbed the stairs out of the trash and the debris. On the first floor he encountered what looked to be apartment doors, but somehow knew that no one was living in them. They were locked but abandoned, so Aiden went up again. On the second floor it was a similar story, except this time a dark cat was sitting at the end of the hall, cleaning itself with its tongue. It stopped when it noticed him, and stared silently with blue-green eyes until it lost interest and went away around a corner. He considered following it, but there was a sudden noise on the floor above him, and he crept back around to another flight of stairs. It was difficult for him to make out what the noise was. Some clatter of some sort, or a thud, and looking up to try and see it, he climbed the stairs 2 at a time, his hand reaching to hold the railing. "Kuso, fucking piece of junk," said a hushed, masculine voice. "Calm down," said another, barely more than a whisper. "Just try it again." "Shinjime Cooper," the first replied. By this point, Aiden had reached near the top of the stairs to find that there was no light, and that two men were lurking by a door on the opposite side of the corridor. One man, with blonde hair and a grey coat, stood over a second who was skulking down in the dark and operating some handheld device. This second man wore a red sleeveless jacket and was holding the device against the door's electronic keypad while manipulating a pair of naked wires with his other hand. "You know I can't understand your ancient fucking language," the blonde man complained. "Just get it done." They both had coastal Kanto accents, a mixture between 21st century Japanese and American English, formed when migrants had created a low-class multicultural community around the old Tokyo Bay. Aiden knew their stereotype, and it likely meant one thing, that they were spice addicts at best, gangsters at worst. He stayed as quiet as he possibly could, trying to decide if asking them for help was worth the risk of them turning on him. No one would ever find his body down there. "Maybe if this piece of shit slicer wasn't as old as my language, we'd be through this door by now," hissed the crouched man. Then suddenly, "Got it!" Electricity crackled, and the locked door slid open with a hum. The crouching man stood, slipping the slicer back into his pocket, and peering through into the apartment with the other man at his side. "It looks empty," the blonde man said. "It can't be. There's got to be something in there. Let's look. I swear to God, if you drag me all the way down to the Steels for a ghost haul, I'm going to kill you myself." Aiden watched as the two men stepped through the door, then crept up to the top of the stairs. He stuck to the darkest shadows, trying to conceal himself from who were clearly illegal scavengers. He decided it was best to leave them, that nothing good could come from them finding out that he was there. When he looked down to the far end of the hallway, he saw a second door that was stuck completely open, leading out onto a walkway that crossed the street outside. The rain was so heavy it was like a curtain across the doorway, and he could hardly see the bridge's far side. Step by step, he crept down the hall towards the outside. The whispering voices of the scavengers echoed distantly in the apartment, and the freezing chill of the outside grew with every step he took. "I can't believe it, fucking empty." All of a sudden, the voice was back and in the hallway, and instinctively Aiden froze there in the darkness, not daring even breathe. He became as silent as death itself, hoping beyond hope that they didn't look his way, that they didn't see his silhouette against the rain. "You led me out here. Again. For nothing. That's it. I'm done with this shit. You can find another partner next time." "What the fuck is that?" Aiden panicked. His flight response kicked in, and suddenly he was sprinting out into the downpour and across the walk bridge, a desperate, flailing attempt to escape. Something snapped past him, accompanied by deafening gunshots that rang out into the storm. A bullet hit the concrete wall to his front, and another the metal door on the bridge's far side, ricocheting away into the night. Then there was a third shot, and Aiden felt it punch through his right shoulder, almost throwing him forward off his feet. Somehow, he maintained his composure. Hot, pale liquid began to flow from his wound, and it spilled out down his clothes and onto the bridge beneath him. Then, as though his body's only sensible reaction had been delayed, his shoulder began to burn unbearably. He released a pained scream, hearing the men shout something incoherent behind him. He ignored them and kept going, stumbling forward towards the closed door to slam his fist against it and beg it to open. It didn't. Then several more shots were fired. A second later, Aiden was lying in the rain, the side of his face pressed against the floor and barely able to move. He shivered and groaned, trying desperately to fight against his own certain death, but he could do nothing but bleed. He felt a boot press against his side, and too weak to stop it, felt it roll him onto his back. He looked up at the two men, each with their handguns ready, and watched as they searched him with their eyes. "Yo, who the fuck is this?" asked the man in the red. "No idea, but what the fuck's he doing here?" asked the blonde. "Shit, man, look at those holes." "Fuck it, Coops. We need to get out of here. Someone will have heard those shots. PMCs will be down here any second." I know. Can't leave this guy, though. If he survives, he might talk." "Then fucking shoot him, man." The blonde man aimed his gun down at Aiden's face. "Sorry, kid," he said, then pulled the trigger. Aiden felt hot, wet blood in his mouth. Everything was dark now. Had he been killed? Or was he simply about to die, lingering like a soul imprisoned in a brain that had not yet ceased to function? There was no pain anymore. That was good. And he could see a light now, down the dark tunnel. It was bright and warm even in the rain, and it was growing closer, more welcoming. All he had to do was go into it, but something told him not to. He turned around slowly and began to realize he was standing. Strange. Hadn't he been lying on the ground? In fact, he could see where he was lying now. He saw the pale liquid on the floor, and the soundless rain hit the concrete under his feet. It wasn't cold anymore. It wasn't hot either, but it wasn't cold. And his body wasn't there. There were bodies, though. One in a sleeveless red jacket, another in a torn trench coat, their guns lying abandoned by their hands. Their blood was all over the bridge, being washed away by the rain, but the lacerations in their flesh were permanent. Dead, both of them. But by whose hand? He raised his fingers towards his face and looked at them, looked at how they were stained with red, and how blood had congealed beneath his fingernails. Then he looked at the holes in his blue shirt, and the unmarked pale flesh beneath them. As the realization that he had killed the two men came to him, so too did the sounds of his environment. His shadow was cast tall on the far side of the bridge by a bright light that came from behind him, and as he heard the rain again, he turned back to the hallway with blood smeared across his face. "Get down! On your knees now!" The masked soldiers shouted as they advanced closer. The neon blue eyes of their helmets, their spotlights, and their submachine guns aimed directly at him. Aiden swallowed, feeling warm blood creep down his throat. He began edging backwards, trying to raise his hands to show his intent to surrender, but the soldiers were scared. He could see the fear in them, in the way they moved, and as he opened his mouth to talk, they opened fire. Their bullets tore through him, forced him back to the side of the bridge, then pushed him over the edge.